What's going on, everybody? Happy October 10th, Tuesday. October 10th on ScreenSpeak, the podcast that's all about movies, life, and so much more. As usual, it's me, Jordan Anderson, your host and creator of this whole thing, with you once again for a new episode that I'm very fortunate and grateful to have each and every one of you be listening on right now. Before I get into everything, go ahead and hit that follow button on whatever podcast platform that you're listening to this on, including the podcast social media over on Instagram. This helps you stay in the know for all things ScreenSpeak, gets you connected with the other cinephiles out there in the world, as well as the filmmakers that listen to this thing, and overall it just keeps the show growing, gaining momentum, and continuing its process of evolution. So definitely do that. Also, wanted to make sure I threw in a plug for the upcoming second annual Refocus Film Festival that's taking place this Thursday, October 12th through the 15th in Iowa City, Iowa. Yours truly is going to be in attendance there, providing some media correspondence for the festival, including recording conversations with the various filmmakers and attendees alike, all the while catching the screenings at the festival itself, taking part in those Q&A sessions that they got, the festivities of the festival, including all their after parties and all that good stuff. All of that's going to be coming, and ScreenSpeak is going to be a part of that, so definitely be on the lookout for that. Or, in other words, if you happen to be in the area, consider attending. Should be a great festival full of terrific films and festivities that you can really only experience by actually being there. So I really think you should consider coming out to the festival if you happen to be in the Iowa City area. I can tell you, just as an Iowa native, Iowa City, it's a great city. It's a great city in and of itself. There's plenty to do there at the festival, and you're going to be in good company with all the fellow film enthusiasts, filmmakers, and artists alike. If you can't make it, no worries. You'll just have to come back to this podcast and listen to what I've gathered from the festival. Okay, plugs are done. On with the show. So this episode marks the fourth in my exclusive series of conversations that were captured at the Iowa Independent Film Festival, the 16th annual Iowa Independent Film Festival. I feel like it's taken a long time to get all the content that I got from there out there, and I'm not going to get into a bunch of excuses for why it's taken so long, other than to say that I have a life. Surprise, surprise, but I do. It keeps me busy. It keeps me really busy, and I refuse to put out something that's half-assed that's got my name attached to it. And plus, I always want to make sure that when it's episodes, in this case, that are featuring guests, that they are presented in the best possible light. So in other words, I don't rush to get them out. I want to make sure that they're properly produced, and when you're listening to it, it's in the best possible way. So try to put the best possible light onto the episode, I guess I should say. Or I could say in this episode, maybe some dark light because of this filmmaker's preferred genre that she likes to work in the most, the horror genre. Ooh, horror. In fact, that was that was the dumbest thing. The ooh. And I'm pretty sure if anyone that actually takes horror seriously talks about the genre in film, they do not add the little ghost noise to it. But whatever, I digress. So I got filmmaker Carrsan Morrissey on this one, digging deep with me on all things horror and more in this episode. So if you're familiar with Carrsan, let me tell you everything that you need to know about her. So Carrsan is from Cedar Falls, Iowa, and is primarily, I would say, known for making horror films that, in my opinion, are pretty raw, gritty, you could almost argue, and pretty uncompromising in its tone. So, in other words, I would say her films have a unique ability to be able to make you, or me watching it, go from being very comfortable to straight up uncomfortable and deeply disturbed in some cases. But honestly, at the end of all of it, you're actually glad that you went through it. And that's not something that I can easily say for a lot of filmmakers, because sometimes you'll watch something that just so takes you out of your comfort zone and you're just like, oh my God, like why did I go through that? That's not really the case with this. Carrsan's films take you on a journey a lot of the time. And it definitely gives me visceral reactions that I don't typically get out of other filmmakers' content that's like hers. So I'm just telling you my experience from the few films that I've actually seen from her. So that's what I'm saying right now. Let's see, what else can I tell you about Carrsan? So her films are often known for having pretty diverse cast and characters in the films, all specifically within the LGBT community, or LGBTQ community, excuse me. Within the context of the horror genre, which is actually pretty interesting. And outside of those just general bullet points that I stated off about her, I can tell you that she's, extremely nice person, very passionate and knowledgeable about the genres of horror, and specifically the subgenres of horror. I know at one point she touches on cosmic horror. There's some other different ones in there that I'm definitely not familiar with, so I could certainly pick her brain about that more in the future. But this person definitely knows their stuff when it comes to horror. My own personal experience with horror films, I admit if I have a genre that I gravitate least towards, it's probably horror. It could just be because I'm a scaredy cat sometimes when I watch stuff. I jump easy. Filmmakers can get me very easily with the jump scares, so I'm definitely one of those people that if you put one in there, it might not even be the most creative thing in the world, but it probably will scare me. And I don't know, I don't go back and revisit a ton of horror movies outside of like some of the real classic ones. The Shining is one that comes to mind, which, speaking of The Shining and speaking of Refocus that I had plugged earlier, they're doing a screening of The Shining at that festival that this podcaster is very fortunate to be able to get in on. So that's going to be cool. But outside of that, I think of horror movies, I think of like The Ring. That thing fucked me up, frankly, when I was a kid. It was terrible. I was afraid of televisions, those analog TVs with the big backs in them. Samara's going to come out and just make my head do the whole face. I don't think they have that noise like when the person's dead from Samara, but I bet they make a noise like that when they're about to, get killed by her. But anyways, yeah, I just don't really watch a ton of horror movies, so it was interesting talking with Carrsan about horror. Certainly actually makes me want to go back and maybe revisit some others that I have not really watched in the past. There's a lot of really interesting films that are being made in the horror genre that are out there, both big and also independently. And I don't know, after talking with Carrsan, it actually makes me think that I should probably, from time to time, not all the time, just go ahead and throw in a horror movie into the queue, so that way I'm keeping a diverse palette, if you will, of movies that I'm watching, instead of just sticking with the safe choices. Because sometimes isn't that like part of, I don't want to say the magic of movies, but part of the experience of films is that they can give you a unique experience that I wouldn't always say is entertaining in the case of certain types of horror movies that can get a reaction out of you, but it does get a reaction out of you. And I don't know, it just makes me think that I really should maybe spend some more time exploring that whenever I can find the time. As far as the conversation goes with Carrsan, we stick mostly within the realms of horror and talk about the different subgenres of horror. We get into a little bit of the stigmas that are against the genre right now. Talk about Carrsan's process that she goes through when it comes to shooting any emotionally difficult scenes or physically difficult scenes or both. We also touch on intimacy coordination in movies, which that subject alone I could probably do a whole podcast on because I think it's actually really interesting. And then we also talk about representation in horror movies specifically, which is something that I don't really feel like gets brought about in a lot of conversation when you talk about accurate representation in films. So definitely interesting stuff right there. After listening to this episode, I would encourage each and every one of you to go ahead and look up Carrsan, look her up on her social, look up her film company, give all that stuff a follow, support it. Check out her stuff because, you might find some really interesting stuff in there or stuff that at the very least is going to give you a reaction. And you're going to be like, man, I don't even know what to think of that. That's the type of movies that this person makes. So last thing I'll say on this before we get into this is that even though, as again I've stated, horror films are not typically my bag, I will say I found it fascinating to pick her brain on the genre and the subject. And that I really think after listening to the playback of this conversation, helped me discover that there's more to the horror genre than maybe I even knew about it before. So there you go. Do with that what you will. All right, that's all I got for the introduction here, everybody. So thanks very much for listening. Hope you're enjoying the October season thus far. Get in some scary movies and enjoy this conversation with Carrsan T. Morrissey right now. Carrsan, what is your last name?
My last name is Morrissey, so I'm one of those pretentious
Morrissey.
artists that uses my middle initials, so I go by Carrsan T. Morrissey.
I mean, I put Jordan V in my name because otherwise Anderson's very basic and
There we go.
it doesn't really help it stand out. So that's cool.
Okay, well, I'm glad to be in good company then.
Yes. Now, last time I saw you, you had blonde hair, and,
Yes.
and now it is blue. I mean,
Now it
I
is
say
blue.
that because they can't see you right now. I don't have a camera rolling, but
No, it's okay. The blue hair was a thing, actually, so I dyed it blue, oh god, 2 years ago now? Time isn't real. Quite a while ago, and then I dyed it blonde and white for a show. I was actually in Dracula in the Cedar Falls Community Theater, and
Oh,
I
awesome.
played Renfield, and Renfield couldn't have blue hair. So I kept the white for a while, but I just missed the blue too much, so...
Did you end up seeing that Renfield movie?
I did.
I have not seen it. What did you think about that?
It's fine. I'm
Yeah.
not a huge horror comedy person, which, judging from my work, probably shows. I'm not a huge levity in horror person. Not that I have a problem with it. It's just not my taste. But I liked it. I thought both actors. God, is it Nicholas Hoult?
Nicholas Hoult and
Nicholas Hoult,
Nicolas Cage. Yeah, two
they
Nicks.
were both good. I actually thought Nicolas Cage. I was like, I almost want to see him in a serious Dracula because he was hammy, but in a fun way.
Right.
Very Hammer horror Dracula in a way that I liked. So yeah, I thought it was fine. Again, not necessarily my cup of tea, but I get why people liked it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, I first met you at the Cedar Rapids Independent Film Festival, and you were screening a different movie there because we're at the Iowa Independent Film Festival, and you're showing a movie called Rot. I believe.
So I just showed Rot, and then in Cedar Rapids I showed The Tower.
The Tower. Can we talk about that a little bit? I mean, I'm not sure if it's still relevant to what you're doing right now.
No, totally, because I also had Snake Alley back in July, and I showed both there. So that's they've both been seen kind of in concert with each other enough.
What was the reception like at Snake Alley?
It was good. I mean, it's. This sounds pretentious, but I always think people don't quite always know how to react because my movies, again, they just don't have a lot of levity. They're not necessarily designed to be fun to watch. They're horror films, but they tend to have kind of a dark, kind of dramatic feel to them too. Mm-hmm. So people really liked it. I think that The Tower especially people tend to like because it's very bombastic and it's a cosmic horror film, mm-hmm. so it has a lot more kind of flash and the scary imagery, whereas Rot is almost as much of a drama as it is a horror film. But yeah, they were both well received at Snake Alley. Actually, well received enough that I got a screening offer.
Really?
For them. So yeah.
What does that entail?
No, it's okay. I can. This is a great opportunity. I can talk about it because it just got announced. I literally checked Facebook 15 minutes ago.
Oh wow!
So I was approached by. Oh my god, I feel so bad. I can't remember his name off the top of my head because I'm so bad with names. But the guy who, one of the representatives from the Grindhouse series they do at Iowa City Film Scene,
mm-hmm.
And they're going to do a showing of Rot on October 4th.
Hey, that's awesome.
Yeah, it's going to accompany the feature they're showing that day, which I believe it's a vampire film
mm-hmm.
with David Bowie, and I can't remember what it's called right now. It's really good. But yeah, so Rot is going to be showing at Iowa City Film Scene for their Grindhouse series, which is really, really cool because I love Film Scene. I really like what they do there.
I'm certainly getting more acclimated and familiar with Film Scene myself. The first time I went there was, I'm trying to think. The first time I went there was a couple years ago, and I can't remember exactly what I saw. But then recently, I saw they did a premiere of the movie 65 with Adam Driver, and they had Scott Beck and Brian Woods afterwards doing a Q&A, and it was really cool. Their location at the Chauncey is really terrific.
Yeah,
fantastic. And then actually, I've talked about it I think before in the podcast, but I'll actually be doing similar thing to what I'm doing now, but at the Refocus Film Festival.
Oh, awesome.
So I'll be attending that.
Is that the one that Werner Herzog's going to be at?
Yes.
Oh my god, that's so cool.
I'm very, very excited for it, and I think they are doing a lot of really interesting and I would almost say experimental things with how they're even doing a festival. I haven't been to it yet, but I got to sit down and talk with Andrew, the one of the co-founders of the place, and he was kind of telling me about it and all the different unique events they have, their combination of combining it with the book festival that's going on then, so they have a lot of authors in town.
Yeah.
What's the Grindhouse series, though? Because I'm not super familiar with that.
It's Wednesday nights, and they show typically cult horror or Grindhouse movies or other kind of pulpy, fun horror, and then they do that on Wednesday evenings, and I'm so influenced by and into late night horror, especially exploitation horror and French extreme horror films like Martyrs and things like that. I like the really crazy stuff. So specifically to be featured as part of a series that is designed to show those types of films is really special to me. And I have some other plans with them in the future that I can't reveal yet.
No, that's fine.
But yeah.
Save a little mystery.
So,
That's good.
Yeah, but it's exciting. So it's cool to be. It's a really cool radar to be on. It's an honor for me to be recognized in that kind of setting among the kind of movies that inspire me. So
speaking of inspiration and just you talking about those different horror genres that you mentioned, I mean, I feel like it would be nice actually to sort of illuminate the different subgenres that are within horror. Because I think sometimes horror, like when you say like that can mean a lot of different things, and it seems like you know a lot about the universe in there. So what are some of these different genres that maybe the average person doesn't know about?
So I'm really into... when we say indie horror now, we tend to think of like A24 is like the first thing people say. Hereditary, or like It Comes at Night, or just recently Talk to Me, which are like three of my favorite movies. I love A24 films. But like people forget that like Texas Chainsaw Massacre was indie horror. Or like, a lot of like the movies that are more on kind of the splatter kind of exploitation grindhouse side of things were also independent horror. And horror has a storied history with independent film. And in fact, a lot of huge directors like Peter Jackson got his start making splatter horror films in Australia, or in New Zealand.
Was it The Frighteners? I mean, I don't know if that's like an early one, but I know
before
about that.
He made a movie called Dead Alive. It's
okay.
like I think it's his first feature. It's bananas. It's absolutely insane.
Right.
Like it's this crazy, like kind of Evil Dead style
okay.
horror.
Yeah.
But like I'm personally, if there's a genre that influences me the most, I would say it's the French New Extreme Horror movement, which is films like High Tension, Martyrs. More recently, Julia Ducarneau is a director I really, really love and look up to. She made a movie called Raw. No relation to the movie Rot, which is something I made just a coincidence. And then, like, I didn't name it after that, but I've had a couple people associate it with it, which is cool.
Well, how did you first get exposed to that genre?
Oh, God. I don't really remember. I think I was really into the idea of making horror that took itself really seriously without being cheesy. I think that was kind of something that early on I wanted to do, because a lot of the really popular horror in America and kind of in like the popular zeitgeist is fun. And I like fun horror movies, but that's not really what I wanted to make. And I saw movies like The Mist growing up, movies that had those really, really bleak endings, and I just was into that because I liked the idea of like horror that really is horrific, that really takes itself seriously, but without necessarily being like shock for the sake of shock or anything like that. And so I think just kind of that rabbit hole led me to more like the European horror scene. And then I also really like combining that with some subgenres of drama, such as the mumblecore subgenre.
What's that?
So mumblecore is a filmmaking movement that came out of New York in the early 2000s. Essentially, it's the moment that filmmaking equipment became affordable.
Okay.
All of a sudden, there were all of these kind of middle to lower middle class people who could never dream of owning like a movie camera could afford one. And so people like Noah Baumbach and especially Greta Gerwig came out of the mumblecore scene. And mumblecore was defined, the reason it's mumblecore actually started as a derogatory term, like mumbling.
I see.
And it was basically people would get together in somebody's apartment and they would come up with a rough outline for a dramatic story, typically a relationship drama. And then they would just act it out with no script. So they were these extremely rough around the edges, usually very like intense and explicit drama films made by people that were completely inexperienced with filmmaking. And it creates this really surreal, very real feeling movie. And like some of them are very bad, some of them are very good. But I really liked the idea of taking sort of that approach to horror. It's sort of why like I really prefer a handheld camera over a camera on a tripod or a gimbal, because I like that kind of like you're in the scene feeling. I like to let the actors move very freely in the scene. I don't do a lot of movement direction when I shoot. I like to like let people move where they want to move, obviously within reason. And that sort of comes from that school of just like allowing the actors to bring the scene to life organically with as little influence on the way it plays out physically as possible.
What are the horror moments that sort of stand out to you from just, you know, maybe not like influential ones, but the ones where you're like, I remember that. Like where like it really left a mark on you.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, to shout out a movie that really influences me, The Mist, was a big one for me. Seeing The Mist, I saw it when I was like, how old I was.
Just to be clear, because I feel like there's more than one version of this, right? I want to say. I know the Thomas Jane one.
Yeah, that's the one I'm thinking of.
That's the one you're talking about?
Yeah.
I could have sworn there's another version of that, but maybe I'm wrong.
There's a TV series that came out a little bit later, yeah.
Okay, maybe that's what I'm thinking.
But I saw that at a really young age when it first came out, and it was unlike anything I had seen horror-wise up to that point, and it has one of the, like, an almost comedically bleak ending. It's not funny, it's horrific, but, like, it's so over-the-top dark. And I just remembered seeing that and being like, okay, so, like, you don't necessarily have to have a happy ending with your movie.
Yeah.
This isn't to say, like, every movie I like is depressing, by the way. I love comedies. I love like, movies that are fun. But, like, for me personally as an artist, I like to kind of go into the darkness.
You know, I feel like I think it's important that you mention that, you know, you still like comedies and you still like the other things. Because I think sometimes there's, like, a stigma when somebody is attached as or labeled as being a horror director or something like that.
No.
They must think, like, they just go home and, like, read nothing but twisted stuff and go you know, do all this stuff. It's like, no, that's one slice of yourself. That's not all of you.
A big thing I really do try to avoid is being edgy. Like, I'm not sitting here trying to be like, oh, I'm such a dark, brooding person and I make these horrific films. Like, no, it's just like, I am interested in taking my characters to extreme places.
Sure.
And I often find that if I'm writing from a genuine perspective of, like, what would happen if this was happening in real life? These are not usually situations that would work out well for these characters.
Right.
So I think it came more from just trying to ground my films in a reality and in the world that they take place in. Not so much from a perspective of, like, you know, how much screwed up stuff can I put on screen?
Let me ask you this as far as horror goes, and I'll try my best to piece my way through this. So there's a lot of horror movies I noticed where, you know, there's just characters that are pretty much in the movie just to get killed.
Yeah.
Like they're just there for that, and, like, it's fine, especially, like, if it's, like, a slasher, you know, sometimes you have the unlikable person where it's just like, oh, you can't wait for them to eat it, and the whole
entire
thing.
2010s of just, like, let's put a bunch of hateable characters in a movie and kill them in gruesome ways. Like, yeah.
But what I'm curious about is for yourself and kind of how you look at horror and the characters that you like the most. Is it better to have a character that, you know, has a little bit of depth and you are invested into them before they die to really have it hit home, or is it just like the way they die that's going to leave a much more indelible impression on you?
Good
Do you kind of get what I'm saying with that?
Yeah, no, totally. I won't say better because I do like both, and I do think it depends on what you're writing. Like, I think there's, you know, if you want to make a slasher with a bunch of cannon fodder characters and just come up with cool special effects, that is absolutely my bag. I'm into that too. For me, I prefer to write characters that the audience will care about. And again, that comes more from wanting there to be an element of drama.
Yeah.
So, like, you know, to me, with what I'm trying to do, I've achieved my goal more if people care when terrible things happen to my characters. That's not to say I haven't written things before with, like, just cannon fodder characters. That, like, it is fun to just write crazy slashers and stuff like that.
Sure.
But, like, the art that challenges me and draws me in the most is when you can make characters that people care about, and then the horror stuff happens.
Yeah.
And then you've really got the audience hooked, because it's like, okay, now I don't want bad things to happen to these people. And a lot of times, especially with people that aren't, you know, as versed in the horror world as, or no, versed, I should say, the people who aren't necessarily as deep in the horror pool as I am, I think when they think of a horror movie, they usually think of, like, okay, disposable characters, guy in a hockey mask with a machete is going to show up and chop them up, and that's going to be it.
Yep.
So I think that it can be a different experience for a lot of people to see a horror film that, like, oh shit, I actually care about these people, and now the bad stuff is happening.
With all the horror movies that you're making and you're working on, does it ever desensitize you to when you watch a horror movie? Like, can you still get scared?
Actually, I am a complete scaredy cat watching horror movies. I am covering my eyes and plugging my ears and having a blast. That has not gone away. That's actually kind of why I enjoy it. I like to make movies that would freak me out. Like, okay, so to bring it back to, like, the movie I showed today, Rot.
Yeah.
Rot is very much a body horror film too. So, like, it's about a character who's getting really sick, and there's a lot of very gross stuff with, like, throwing up and hives and rashes and stuff like that.
Okay.
And, like, that's actually all stuff that really deeply freaks me out. I can't handle that kind of stuff in real life. So channeling that into a horror film was fun, because it was like, okay, how could I make myself as, like, if I was watching this from the audience's perspective, you know, it gives you sort of a clue as you're shooting something into, like, how to take it to where you want it to go. And yeah, it's fun to work with the things that scare you.
What challenges you today? I mean, like, because I imagine, you know, you seem to be somebody that's always kind of trying to, I don't want to say like find the limit and cross it, but you're always wanting to, I think, push yourself creatively.
Yeah, and again, I'll give one caveat in that, like, my goal is never to, well, I shouldn't say never. My goal is never to offend my audience from a standpoint of, like, just wanting to put some edgy shit on screen to freak people out.
Right.
Like, I'm not trying to make, like, something that's truly offensive or horrific. I want there to be a point. Mm-hmm. So there are definitely lines that I won't cross, or rather kind of boundaries and principles that I set for myself in my writing. Mm-hmm. What challenges me is finding ways to combine, again, just further melding horror and drama. I think I want my films to be scary. I want them to be, you know, I want people to be watching through their fingers, but also be invested in the story. Yeah. And I think that that's something that can be really hard to do, because I think sometimes as soon as the horror stuff starts, people just don't really give a shit about the story anymore.
Right.
So sort of finding a way to keep the stories exciting and keep them engrossing while also pulling off the stuff that I want to do from a scary movie perspective can be challenging. And then also just, I always want to do better than I did last time. You know, so every time I make something, I'm already excited about the next thing and how I can do better and how I can keep improving my craft from just a filmmaking standpoint.
Do you think you would ever explore other genres or maybe like combine genres into it?
Yeah, I mean, I actually have. I made just a purely dramatic feature called Roulette Girl, which was a lot of fun. But again, it's not so much that I'm averse to the idea, but it just doesn't interest me as much.
Sure.
And I also so like, I want to caveat this is not a pushback to the question you just asked.
Oh yeah, no, you're
but
fine.
Like, I always find that, like, you know, nobody ever asks somebody that makes dramas, have you ever considered making a horror film? You know what I mean? Like yeah. Usually not. I think that there's sort of this stigma with horror that horror is a low art. You know, like, and
why the stigma?
Because it's, again, people associate it with slashers and with, like, just kind of silly fun. Oh, well, let's get a bunch of teenagers in a cabin and they're gonna do drugs and have premarital sex and then die.
Right.
And so I want to show that horror can be as good and as high quality and as well crafted and well acted and well directed as anything else.
Yeah, you know, that's actually, you know, thinking about that, because I do understand, at least from an indie point of view, like why horror sometimes gets a stigma or a type on it, because sometimes it's cheap to produce, you know, there's effects, so there's natural jump scares and stuff that you can throw in that don't take a lot of imagination, frankly, to get there.
Right.
But I am trying to think, like, really back, and maybe you can help me with this, but critically speaking, whether you want to say, like, you know, Academy or Golden Globes, anything like that, I can't really think of many horror films that get any sort of, like, real serious accolade in that type of a field.
I mean, am I wrong? Rare. No.
Yeah.
You're not wrong at all. It's extremely rare. The Exorcist and Silence of the Lambs are the two that come to mind, and off the top of my head, those are the only two I could think of.
But even like Silence of the Lambs, I mean, like, I'm not discounting it. It's a fantastic movie, but I mean, I don't even know if I feel like that to me is like horror. It's like, it's deeply suspenseful and mystery.
It falls under the umbrella, and that's, you know, that's another whole, you could do an entire debate episode about what is or what isn't horror.
That's true.
I tend to fall into the category of, if it scares you, it can be a horror movie. Like, maybe something that isn't horror to me is horror to somebody else, and that's fine.
Well, what do you think? What do you think prevents it from reaching that level? You know, where like people would take it more seriously, or at the very least recognize the skill that went into it.
I really think there's a stigma. So like here's a good example. A really common word you'll hear a lot right now is elevated horror. Okay. People will refer to movies like The Babadook or Hereditary as elevated horror films.
Why are they saying that?
Because they're quote-unquote better than what you would typically associate a horror film with being. So they're almost making it its own genre. Okay. Like an A24 film or an elevated horror film, which, like, by the way, A24 is a distribution company. Like, now they've started making films, but, like, they didn't make those movies. Not that I don't love them for what they distribute.
Yeah.
But just, like, to clarify. But, like, elevated horror is not the best term in my mind. Because, like, no, it's a horror movie. It's just a good film.
Yeah, I think that's just a way of saying, like, it's better than some others in the genre.
Yeah, it's a way of calling it good while still putting down the genre that it's a part of. Mm-hmm. So it's like, no, it's just a good horror movie. Like, just like there can be good dramas, and, like, there are some terrible dramas and terrible comedies, terrible everything out there, and nobody says it's an elevated drama or an elevated action film or an elevated comedy. It's just horror that we kind of put it in this box. Mm-hmm. And so I think if I have a challenge, it is to make movies that are just as scary and horrific as anything anybody else is making, but also show that you can do it really, really well. And obviously, I don't think I've gotten anywhere near there yet. I have so many things I still want to do. But that's the goal. You know, if I can just continue to show that you can tell a good story really well. And yeah, it's a horror film, but it's not defined by whether it's, you know, it's not elevated horror. It's just a horror movie.
Right.
So
I'm just trying to think like how to kind of push that forward. I mean, like what can you do?
Oh God, I don't know. I certainly am. I'm not the arbiter of of the entire horror genre, but like,
I don't know if there really is one person to do
there's
that.
Not. I do think though, actually, kind of bouncing off of that, I think just continuing to talk about horror films as movies, not as horror movies, just the same way you talk about anything else. So like,
yeah,
you know, we just kind of tend to put horror into a box, and by we I mean like the film community at large, especially the Academy and like the mainstream kind of like Hollywood critics. Yeah. Which I don't think is malicious. I think it's just a product of the history of horror as a niche or sort of actually I think niche is the right word. It's sort of a niche genre. It's its own thing, separate from what everyone else is doing. And there can be good things about that too. Some very bold artists have come out of horror that I think they can do what they do because you can get away with a lot in a horror film. Right. But I do think there's a point where you have to open the door and just be like, hey, this is really good. We don't have to say it's good for a horror movie. It's just a good film.
I'm curious, you know, because do you know other people that are making horror films? I'm assuming you probably do.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's tons of people in Iowa and in the larger film scene that are making horror films, particularly Terrell Christie in Cedar Falls and Waterloo makes some really good horror. Tristan Bennett and the team and his team have made some really good thrillers and horror films. Lots. Oh God, I'm too many names in my head right now. But yeah, like there are lots of people that are making really, really good horror. And on a broader scale, certainly, nationally and internationally, there's some really good horror being made. I actually just got, The Tower and then my 48-hour horror film, To Witness Death just got into Halloween-apalooza. Okay,
where is that at?
It's in Ottumwa. Okay. And there's 50 films in that festival. So, like, you know, that's 50 different horror movies made by people all over the world. So there are lots of people doing it, but I just think that I think that the broader film community needs to be more willing to accept horror. And I also think that we as horror filmmakers need to be willing to put ourselves out there into the broader film scene. Like there are a lot of horror filmmakers that I think really try to stick to, like, I'm going to do horror film festivals. I'm going to like, right. I'm going to, that's going to be my brand. Those are the people I'm most comfortable with.
They know the demographic. They know the broad reaching scope of it on that specific side of it.
And I love that stuff too. Don't get me wrong. But I think that we have to approach it from an, we're serious filmmakers. We are trying to further the craft and further our personal art as much as anybody else. And I'm I feel like I'm making it sound like horror filmmakers are like oppressed. I'm not saying that by any stretch of the imagination. No. Just that I think that in order for horror to be taken more seriously at the professional level, it has to start at the indie level. And so we just have to start treating horror like any other genre. Like, I also think like one thing that I thought was really cool today was that Rot was in a block with just other movies that weren't horror films. Sure. And like, don't get me wrong, I love horror blocks. Like at Snake Alley, we were in the late night block and that was awesome. Right. But I also think like throw horror movies in with everything else in film festivals and just like it doesn't always need to be its own niche thing. And I think that sort of shows that, like, again, this is just another genre. It's just another craft of filmmaking, no different than anything else.
Do you get a lot of questions, after your screenings that you've been to and whatnot from people?
Oh, yeah. I mean, like, yes, and I mean, I'm newer to the scene, especially the I've only been doing film festivals now for about 3 or 4 years.
That's longer than me.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah. But, like, and I think like today, Charlie, I think he's still the president of the film festival board.
Yes, he is.
He asked a really good question about Rot, which was just like, when we're filming these really, really intense scenes, do we need to like take breaks? Which like, yeah. I get a lot of questions. Typically things like that of just like, how do we handle filming really intense content? Which the answer is, it's all make believe. Like at the end of the day, we all take the fake blood off and go home. And we also do a lot of prep work ahead of time. Like, especially if it's dealing with something that's really violent or disturbing, we'll do a lot of prep work in rehearsals. We'll talk through it. We'll bring in intimacy coordinators if we need to.
Yeah.
Particularly, I really like working with Stephanie Schneider. Shout out Stephanie. She's amazing. But
who's that?
She is an intimacy coordinator I worked with on my movie Roulette Girl, and she's also the intimacy coordinator for The Salvages, the movie that I'm making next.
I imagine, if we can go down that road for a little bit, just talking about the intimacy coordinator stuff. That's actually a really interesting subject to me. It's not something I really get into that much. Not that it's taboo or anything like that, but I think a lot of people probably actually have a hard time discussing it.
So but
it's very important.
Yeah, and to kind of dip into something else, like another thing I've gotten questions about is like I have found I am less afraid of putting nudity or sexual content into films than a lot of other indie filmmakers, and I think again it's because it's hard to do that in a way that is safe. And I think the way to do that in a way that is safe is working with an intimacy coordinator. If you're doing a fight scene in a movie where you have people fighting with fake swords, typically you're not just going to put swords in people's hands and just be like, okay, go at it. Like, people do that. You shouldn't.
Yeah, but not safe.
But it's not safe. And so filming an intimacy scene is no different than filming a fight scene or filming a stunt scene. You should have somebody on set who is an expert who can talk to the actors and work with them in a way that has an even-handed power dynamic. And so that nobody's doing anything they're not comfortable with, and everyone knows going in what you're going to be doing.
Can you be specific a little bit about like what the intimacy coordinator does? I mean, it sounds like obviously like a lot of advisement and kind of guidance on it.
You should absolutely talk to Stephanie about this because
it's really interesting.
I'm going to butcher her craft, which she puts a lot of work into. But there's typically they meet with the actors, they have a long discussion with them about what they're comfortable with and not comfortable with, whether from nudity or from a standpoint of just like what's being acted out in the scene, anything like that. And then they'll talk to the director and say, okay, this is what they've said. And then from that point, it's the director's responsibility to work around that. Like, this isn't a debate. This is what they are or are not comfortable with.
Okay.
Which, again, I think is completely fair. You wouldn't expect somebody who had never, again, done some crazy stunt before, never jumped off a 50-foot building to be like, okay, you're going to do this in this scene. You meet in the middle between what the director is looking for and what the actors are okay with, and the way you do that is with an intimacy coordinator.
Sure.
So from that point, once it's been established what the scene is going to entail, the intimacy coordinator will typically choreograph the scene with the actors. Again, no different than choreographing a fight scene or anything else.
Sure.
So everything is pre-planned before cameras roll. You're not making it up on the go. And to me, it just makes sense. I think it's the most ethical way of doing things. It's the most professional way of doing things.
Yeah. It's
the best way to ensure that nobody gets hurt emotionally or physically.
Yeah.
And that everyone can feel proud of what eventually does end up on screen.
I think sometimes, like, when people look at nudity in films, and I'm not talking strictly horror on this one, just kind of more broadly on it, but I think sometimes nudity on camera, people, they become so desensitized to it because they see it in a lot of different places. And I think they kind of forget sometimes the risk that a person puts themselves through to do that. It's an incredibly vulnerable position.
Absolutely.
To be in.
And I do think, we all know there's a long history of exploitation and really negative connotations with this in Hollywood and in film. But there are real people behind all that stuff, and that's something that I also have to keep in mind as a filmmaker. Like when I'm writing a script, when I'm shooting, when I'm casting, there always has to be a consideration of like everything that is in this script, I'm going to have two people act out in a scene. And that's not just for intimacy, that's for violent scenes, that's for intense like verbal arguments. Like especially Rot has a lot of really intense like interpersonal just arguments in it, and that's something that we really had to do with care when we were shooting that, because even that kind of stuff can be really intense to shoot. I do think sometimes people think like it's you're just pretending to yell at each other, and like to an extent that's true, but also you get into it, when you're acting, especially, you're in that character's head. You have to sort of take yourself there at least a little bit safely. And so there has to be care going into that of like, we're going to shoot something that's really intense. Let's make sure everybody knows what they're doing. Let's make sure we've all talked about this so that nothing happens that is a surprise or that's going to negatively affect somebody later.
Yeah, I think, when you get to those heavy emotional places, whether it is like a, screaming or crying or something like that, I mean, yes, people don't, people that are watching, they're like, okay, yeah, it's acting. Maybe really good acting, of course.
Yeah.
But I still imagine, and I haven't talked to many actors or actresses that have, or just actors, I should just say actors, that go through the emotional scenes, but it's like you are still a human. The reason it's so convincing is because like those tears or like the face getting red, like that's the person really pushing themselves there.
Yeah, and I think some of this has been sort of warped by the perspective of like we hear a lot about like method acting, right? Like actors that will like completely take themselves like, and it's not even that. Like, you know, even if you're not method, you're still having to take yourself to a place. You're still having to, you know, even feigning emotion can be incredibly exhausting.
Yeah. And you have to feel it deeply in the scene.
Well, or even just physically. Like, you know, if you're doing a scene where you're screaming and crying and throwing up on the bathroom floor, which happens more often than you think in my films.
Right.
Like, that's just a physically exhausting thing to shoot.
Right.
And so, like, there just has to be, you have to take that into account when you're making a film.
Right.
And I do really try to emphasize, like, I always try to plan to film something an hour or two longer than I think we're going to need, because sometimes you need to take breaks. You need to slow down. You need to rework something because you thought it would be okay to do it one way, and then it's not working, so you have to try something different. And the more empathy you can have as a filmmaker for the people that are actually going to be acting the scene out, the better the outcome is going to be. Because I really push back on the idea of, like, the intense auteur filmmakers. Like, okay, like, I love Kubrick movies, but, like, I don't go into a movie thinking everything that I wrote has to happen exactly the way that it's written and there's no flexibility. Like, you're going to make something, in my opinion, better if everyone feels safe and comfortable while they're making it.
Yeah.
If you make everyone uncomfortable and you make people do things that they don't necessarily feel comfortable doing because it's in the script, you might end up with a performance that isn't as natural or as good as you would if you just said, you know what, let's figure out what we can do here. And oftentimes, when you take those moments and you take that time, even if at the time it's frustrating to have to stop for a minute and talk things through, you're going to ultimately end up with something that's stronger because everybody involved, from the person holding the camera to the person directing, or the same person, and to the actors on screen, everyone is on the same page.
Yeah.
And that's something that I really try to make a strong attempt at on my sets.
I mean, I think that's pretty commendable on there, just because to me, film at its highest form is a collaborative medium. You know, I want people to be able to interject ideas, you know, have a different take on a scene than what's written on the page. Sometimes, you know, beautiful moments happen from that you least expect.
Oh my gosh. They're like, okay, one of my favorite moments in Rot, I don't want to ruin anything too much, but like,
where can people watch this, by the way?
Nowhere yet. It's not online yet.
Okay, I was going to say, like, if I could put in the link or something like that, I could do that.
It's still in consideration for a couple of festivals.
Okay.
But eventually it'll be on my Vimeo, which I'll give you all the links for all that stuff.
Yeah, definitely.
But, like, you know, there's a great moment in Rot after this really intense argument scene where my friend Linnea, who plays Eden, did this throwaway line that wasn't in the script, but it's so cutting. It's such a brilliant little tag to the end of the scene. And it's like, I didn't make that up. They made that up. So, like, I really do advocate for, like, yeah, I'm proud of my writing and I'm proud of my direction, but I'm also extremely proud of the people that I get to work with that trust me enough to put themselves out there for these films and who bring their talents to it, because without them, this doesn't exist. You know, my scripts or my direction or my filmography can be great. If I don't have anyone to work with, or if I have actors who don't trust me, you're going to get a subpar product regardless. But like a subpar finished film no matter what.
Yeah.
So more than anything, I want it to be fun. I want it to be safe. You know, a joke that I have made a couple of times with friends that I shoot with is like, fun to make, not fun to watch. So like, it's something like Rot, you know, we're all friends. We had a great time making that, even though the actual movie is super depressing.
Yeah.
We had a good time on set because we were all safe and we all knew what we were getting into. So.
You know, something else I wanted to ask you about, and if you don't want to talk about it, that's totally fine. I'm just curious. You know, I hear in a lot of different genres in film, you know, there's not always there's misrepresentation or not proper representation, things like that. In the horror genre specifically, do you think there's good representation there? Is there room to grow there, or what's
a good question?
Yeah,
it's a tough question. So like, I am a transgender person.
Yeah.
And so I do think that sometimes like people might assume I have an outsized opinion on trans representation in horror, and I do to an extent.
Well, representation can mean a lot of things outside of just sexual orientation too.
Yeah, well, but to me, it's more about like, okay, but what can we do going forward? Like, we can sit here and argue all day whether Silence of the Lambs is a terrible movie or not because of Buffalo Bill. I have very strong mixed feelings about it because it's one of my favorite films. It's also sometimes a tough movie to watch for me.
It is, yeah.
Because it's like, oh God. But, you know, like, to me, my favorite kind of representation is representation where it's not about the fact that the characters are trans or the characters are gay or the characters are anything. Mm-hmm. They are just people who live in a world and are living their lives. Yeah. So like in Rot, it's depicting marriage between two people who are queer. And the fact that they are a same gender or at least like gender non-conforming relationship is never addressed in the film once.
Right.
And like, I'm not trying to make some big grand statement by doing that, but rather it's just that it is normalizing in so much as like, this is a situation that can happen to anybody. It doesn't matter if it's a cisgender couple or a same-sex couple or a trans couple. It's like, these are just human beings going through regular human being problems. Right. And so like, to me, that's the representation I lean the most toward in my films because like, I tend to write a situation and put characters into it. That's sort of my approach. Mm-hmm. And so I like to write queer characters because I am an LGBT person. So that's the perspective I like to write from.
Right.
But I don't like to make that what my stories are about. Mm-hmm. It's more about just the representation being very there. And we all probably noticed it, especially if it's something that we really wanted to notice, but now we're moving on.
Right.
And because to me, that's how life is. You know, I don't spend every moment of every day thinking about the fact that I'm trans. It's only when other people point it out to me or like when it's something that becomes relevant to a situation. But I think in movies, especially even in some really well-meaning or even really good films, so much attention is drawn to the fact that this character is LGBT and that's their character trait.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm really trying to avoid is like, I'm just trying to write LGBT characters that are going through whatever the situation was going to be when I came up with this concept for any character. And that is the lane that I'm trying to
well it probably I would imagine it helps Carrsan just being a trans woman and being around I'm assuming a community I'm assuming other people
I say this in a joking tone, but it's really not a joke. The reason I started writing so many LGBT characters is just that my friends and the people that I work with tend to also be in the community.
Sure.
And I didn't want to make them play straight. It's like, why bother? Why not just write the characters? It only really occurred to me a little bit later when my films started to get those kinds of questions. It's like, oh, this is something that people are going to notice and think. Like, I was at a film festival the other day and somebody asked about Rot and asked if I was trying to make some kind of statement by having them be a same-sex couple that falls apart.
Right.
I was like, and for the record, I'm not dissing the person who asked that question.
Right.
If they're listening to this.
They asked the question. Yeah.
But it's like, no, but... Like nowadays, I guess it occurs to me more that that's something people are going to think. When I first started making movies, that really wasn't something that crossed my mind. And now it's become more of a thing of like, the whole point is that that's not the case. The point is that nothing that happened to those characters happened to them because they're LGBT.
Right.
And that's something that is a trope, especially early on in the horror genre. Like, it was a case, and I don't remember exactly what year to what year it was that this was the case. But like, there was a while where if you wrote a same-sex couple in a movie, it was expected that they would die at the end. Or that something bad would happen to them and they would break up because that was morally wrong. And like that was an actual part of, I think it was the Hays Code. I don't remember what it's called. There was a code or a kind of a unwritten set of rules in Hollywood that was what was supposed to happen. And that's literally where the trope of LGBT people dying or having bad things happen to them in movies comes from. It was a manufactured thing. And so now it's like, yes, I make movies that have LGBT characters in them, and yes, bad things happen to them in those movies often because I make horror movies.
Right.
But not because the characters are LGBT. More so just because I'm trying to highlight actors who are LGBT without having that be the cornerstone of the character that they're in.
Now, if you ever get questions about, a perceived statement or something like that, is this coming from, a person that perceives themselves as straight? Is it coming from people that are in the community?
I've done both. Yeah. I think that more often especially now, like I'm openly transgender. I'm sort of part of the community side. These are more just conversations I might have with friends.
Yeah, yeah.
But like at film festivals, I think it's more, it tends to be, I don't know. Actually, the more I think about it, I guess I shouldn't necessarily make a judgment on that because I don't really know.
Right.
But I think that it tends to come more from a perspective of people who are trying to learn or trying to understand, rather than people who are necessarily part of the community and who are looking into my motives. That tends to be a question I might get asked privately more than publicly.
Sure, yeah, of course.
Especially earlier on than now.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. It sort of depends on the festival. It depends on the people.
Yep.
I've had really interesting conversations with straight and cis people and with LGBT people about the representation in my films. I think that it just depends.
You know, I think for myself, Carrsan, like, I don't know many people that are in the trans community, the LGBTQ community. I've certainly met people that are part of it, and it's fine. You know, as a straight man myself, yeah, I mean, sometimes I have a moment of pause, you know, where I'm just like, okay, I don't quite know if I, need to, phrase, a person's pronouns differently or anything like that. It's something that can happen. I certainly think if I ever did ask questions about it, it's more from a perspective of just, I want to be able to understand. And as you said, and I'm glad you did bring this up earlier about just normalizing this whole thing.
Yeah,
because to me, like if you had a film that has, trans people or someone that's queer, as you said, I mean, I may notice it just because it's there and I see it, but then, like you said, after that, it should just be, okay, dismissed, and now they're,
so
it's like
my, I think my dream world, and a lot of people's dream world, would just be a world where, like, somebody can say, oh, this is Carrsan, he's a filmmaker. I can go, actually, she. And they go, oh, never mind, this is Carrsan, she's a filmmaker. And that's the extent of the conversation, and we don't live in that world. We live in a world that is very much the opposite of that, especially right now.
Yeah.
But it's not, there's this perception, I think, especially that LGBT people, that trans people, especially right now with trans people, that we're indoctrinating people or we want to make people trans, which you cannot make someone transgender.
Yeah. I don't
want to go too far down this road right now because I want to talk about movies, but, like,
you're good.
But there is this thing of just, like, it's also okay to just say someone is, to be corrected on somebody's pronouns and go, oh, okay, and then move on.
Yeah. And
it doesn't need to be anything more than that. And that is really what I would hope, certainly I'm not going to bring anyone to that point by myself. But, that would be, if I were to put anything out there into the world of just, like, how I would want people to address me or any of my friends or colleagues who are trans, it's like, just don't make a big thing out of it.
Yeah.
It doesn't kill you to just use the pronouns somebody asks you to use.
Yeah.
And, that's where I'm at with that.
I can say this, I'll say this, and then we can move on from the subject. I'm happy to do that. But, I know people that are, different race and stuff like that. My wife is Brazilian and whatnot. So, she comes from a different country and stuff like that. And I really actually try to just make a conscious effort that if I ever, like, tell stories that involve other people, let's say, because we all do it when we're out with friends and stuff like that, I never, like, make it a point to be like, oh, I'm out with my friend who's black, or like I do anything like that. I'm like, I just say the name, and, like, if it for some reason were to add to, like, the story for some reason, or it should be put in, maybe, but it's like, why do I need to put a label on it? I don't need to.
I certainly don't equate the struggles of, like, my particular struggles with the struggles people associate with racism. Like, certainly there are tie-ins, like, for instance, black trans people have it much harder than white trans people do.
Yeah,
that's
I can imagine
how
that.
the world is. And that's something that needs to be talked about. But, like, I also don't want to equate the two, because obviously racism and transphobia or homophobia are different and tied together in very complex ways that I could go into. But again, that's another podcast and another conversation.
Yeah, no, I got you.
But, I just think that people are people. People have traits, and it doesn't, equity is the goal. The goal is to just be able to live in a world where we don't have to constantly explain or justify our existence. Like, I make movies as a transgender filmmaker. I make movies featuring LGBT people and often about LGBT people.
Yeah.
But, I'm not necessarily trying to make some grand statement. I'm just writing from my perspective and within my community.
And I do appreciate you, like, talking about it a little bit. And I also know it's not something I would want to talk about at great length, because I imagine, Carrsan, from your perspective on this, and there's probably plenty of people in the community that feel this way, I'm sure after a while it gets exhausting.
Extraordinarily.
I'm just saying, I'm like, I can feel that it's like, oh, Jesus, here we go again.
Well, this is we're on the subject, you
Yeah.
never know what you're going to say that somebody who does not like people like me is going to listen to and go, oh, I can't believe she said that, or I guess.
Right.
So it's like, you would think this would be something that would be safe to talk about and have a discussion about, but it isn't always.
Yeah,
and
that makes me very sad.
No, it's I am privileged to be in the position that I am in, and to be a person. I am in a community of filmmakers where my work is known and respected, and that does give me a certain amount of privilege, and that's sort of why I also think it's important for me to talk about these sort of things. And so, I don't know, that's sort of all I want to say on that subject, but it's a complicated subject. So.
Yeah, it definitely is multifaceted and has a lot of different complexities to it. But at the end of the day, I think I can say this just about movies more broadly speaking on this. That's, I think, one of the reasons that movies speak to me so loudly is they can communicate different things that are going on in society, whether it be serious or whether it just makes me think. And I don't know, other different forms of art, I mean, they certainly do that in different ways, but movies have a way of connecting people in ways that I don't really see in a lot of different arts. And that's ultimately what I like to focus on as far as like people coming together on
and
this
is
sort of
another
thing.
As a way to sort of bring this back to horror and broaden the scope a bit.
Yeah.
There is a very strong history of horror and social movements and social justice. Like there is a very strong tie-in. Like a lot of people don't realize that like Texas Chainsaw Massacre was very much an anti-Vietnam film.
Now it's been a minute since I've seen that, but you want to explain that?
Like it was a commentary on the violence of like literally putting people into the meat grinder. There's a very strong history, and like granted, you know that more if you know more about like Tobe Hooper as a person, but like there's a strong history of horror and horror filmmakers being tied to social justice movements. Like people like John Carpenter, Wes Craven, Tobe Hooper were all very big activists, very outspoken activists in their time for working class issues, for race issues, for LGBT issues. And so I think that's another reason why you'll find a lot of people in various minority groups kind of flocking to horror, because there just is this history of horror being used to tell stories from an allegorical perspective about people who might be underrepresented or underprivileged.
Could you explain the allegorical thing a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, like, okay, here's a go-to. Have you seen They Live by John Carpenter?
No, but I feel like that's the one with the kick ass and chew bubble gum. That one?
Yeah, like that's a huge, the whole movie's an allegory for like capitalism and consumerism. Or George Romero's zombie movies were an allegory for consumerism at the time and sort of that culture. And this is people have written theses on this, but
I'm sure.
There's so there certainly are horror films that are designed either explicitly or implicitly to various extents to be allegories for things that are going on in the real world. To me, I tend to deal more with interpersonal issues or like person to person. Rot is a relationship movie, for instance. So I wouldn't say I delve too heavily into that side of things, just because, again, my movies tend to take a slightly smaller scope. Although, who knows, maybe I'm missing the messages in my own films. But, I do think that in a broader context, there is a very strong tie between horror and social justice. And that might be another reason why it's always been kind of boundary pushing. There's a lot of times a good horror movie might make people uncomfortable for reasons they don't quite even fully get.
Yeah.
But there's just something about it that's like, I don't know, this made me feel a certain way. And that's a brilliant thing that film, any art really, can do, is you can tell a story that on the surface is one thing, but also has layers to it that might get to people in a way that makes them think or makes them realize, like, hey, I've never thought about it that way, or I've never felt driven to root for a character that looks like that, or that believes that, or that acts like that, and now I found myself doing that, and why is that?
So kind of what I'm hearing from you is that you're saying that in certain cases, certain films, there is almost maybe I'm not phrasing this right, a healthy level of discomfort that it's okay to go through.
I am a huge proponent of art should, oh god, I'm going to butcher this quote, comfort the uncomfortable and disturb the comfortable. God, I don't know the exact quote, but basically, good art should challenge the norms and should elevate the stories of people who are oppressed. Yeah. Not always. You can make art that isn't allegorical, and that's fine. But if you're trying to do that, you can do it really, really well. And horror has a really strong history of that. Like, and I literally joked with a friend of mine just the other day of like, I definitely fall into the make the comfortable uncomfortable category.
Yeah.
But that's just my thing.
Well, I think like by being uncomfortable on there, I mean, certain emotions will lead your thought process down certain roads, right? And the feeling of discomfort specific to horror is a very specific kind of emotion that outside of the horror genre, I mean, I'm sure you could find it in different slices in real life.
Yeah, well, and
but it's a unique feeling.
There's a catharsis to horror. There's a feeling of like, well, there's a lot of shitty stuff happening in my life, but I can watch a horror movie and be scared and watch all these crazy things happen to these people in this movie, and that takes me out of my real world problems for a minute.
Sure.
Or maybe it helps me process my real world problems in a way of, making it into the literal boogeyman. And so there's a whole very complicated history of psychology and social justice and horror and why we enjoy scary stories.
Yeah.
From them being a way to teach lessons, to them being a way to preach, to them being just a way to have fun. And I think a lot of the best horror films sort of fall into all three categories in various ways.
Do you ever have any, favorite techniques where, because, the jump scare is something I hear a lot in horror and whatnot, where like,
I don't do a lot of jump
used.
Scares.
But are there things where like if you see it in a movie and you're just like, you know what, like that's one where if you put that in any movie, it can have an effect on somebody.
To bring this kind of back around to like the A24 horror films and all that, like, some of my favorite startling moments or effective moments in horror films is when you can pull off almost like a jump scare without it being a proper, like no music stinger, no dramatic, like if you can just cut from one thing to another thing completely unexpectedly and jar the audience that way, and in a way that they're not going to see, like, without broadcasting it, I think that's brilliant. Like, if you've seen the movie Hereditary, the cut to Charlie's severed head on the side of the road is brilliant because you don't see it coming. But it's not a jump scare. It's just a cut. It's just a simple cut from one thing to another thing. And it's not broadcasted. You don't see, and it's not telegraphed in a way that feels cheap. So I guess if there's a way that I would try to do scares, it's more that way. But I also really like horror movies that don't have any startling moments, any jump scares at all, and can still get under your skin.
Yeah.
That's something I think I personally really strive for.
I know what gets me, and I've seen it. It's a very minor thing. If there's a technical term for it, go ahead and feel free to pop it in there. But anytime I see in a movie where there's the medicine cabinet thing, where like someone's opens the medicine cabinet, they look for stuff, they close it. There's a thing behind
there
them.
There is indeed a trope. It's called a mirror jump scare.
Yes,
that is a very common.
That one gets me every time, but the one that actually stands out to me, where I've never seen a movie do it quite like this, and I don't know if you've seen this movie because it's very old. The Changeling, the George C. Scott movie from like the 70s.
God. I am familiar with it, but I have not seen it.
So I'll set up the scene for you here, just so you can kind of like wrap your head around it. So it kind of is, this guy's in his home, and there's a little boy that's haunting the house, essentially. That's the kind of the whole premise, is he's trying to get to the bottom of why this boy is haunting the house. And anyways, I'm going to botch this, but people that have seen this will understand. So there's a cop that's been kind of investigating sort of a subplot thing, and he's like on his way to the house, and they kind of are cutting back between the guy in the house, the cop on the road going to the house, right? And then somehow, the character's in the bathroom and he's going through the medicine cabinet thing, and then he closes it. And then what they do is they superimpose the cop's like face, like being like smashed through the car windshield. And they like, it's like there's the mirror, and then all of a sudden it's cracked. His face just like literally jumps in there.
Okay.
I don't know how they did it, but what they were showing is that Joseph, the boy haunting the house, somehow made this police officer crash his car and like wanted the guy that he's haunting to see this person die.
Yeah, so it's almost like a creative way of doing a flashback, basically, or
it was really weird. And if I'm not explaining that scene right, I mean, just try to look it up.
I'm
sure you can find it.
I want to watch it. Yeah.
And
if it makes you feel better, also there have been multiple times throughout this conversation where I've been describing things and I've just been thinking in the back of my head, like, oh God, people that know what they're talking about are screaming at me right now because I'm explaining this wrong.
No.
To me, at the end of the day, I think a way to kind of sum up everything I've said about horror is that horror is also deeply personal. what scares you might not be what scares me. What I consider
Sure.
a good horror film is probably not what other people might consider.
Well, it's just
a good
like
horror
it's
film.
just like comedy.
Yeah,
Super
yeah.
subjective.
Yeah, and that's why, like, you know, I don't profess to say, like, oh, I make elevated horror films. Because who knows? I'm sure there are plenty of
No.
people that think the kind of movies I make are shit, and I'm sure there are plenty of people that think that it's elevated and everything in between.
Yeah.
And to me, that's another fun thing about horror, is it is so personal.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's also why it is so broad and hard to define. Because horror can be so many different things
Yeah.
to so many different people, just like comedy.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so that's the main thing. It's hard to describe something, put it into proper terms when it is nebulous.
Last couple of questions here, because I don't know how much you want to sit and chat with me. I'm having a good time.
You're fine.
But I'm curious, what are the films that you've enjoyed seeing so far at this festival?
Oh, God. I have only seen one block. I just saw the block that I was in.
Yep.
The one funny anecdote that my girlfriend Rose and I were talking about. There was a French film that showed that did not have subtitles.
Yep.
And there were a lot of,
I was there for that.
No, it's
Yeah.
okay. And there were a lot of murmurs about why there weren't subtitles.
Was
and
that
we both-
intentional?
Well, that's actually, we were talking about the fact that we kind of enjoyed that because it was almost like it made it very interpretive, and that was just a cool experience.
Yeah.
I have to give a shout out to the folks that made Meeting Michael, because there's some really talented people that I know that were behind that.
I've seen a couple of them in other shorts presented at this festival as well.
There was a really, really funny comedy piece about internet, like computer login passwords.
Password problems.
And again, I've said
Yeah.
I don't really usually like comedy that much, and that one made me laugh a lot.
Yeah.
It was very, very funny, very good escalation humor.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful documentaries, a couple of them that were really, honestly, I don't know, it was a very varied block. There was comedy that made me laugh, there was drama that really moved me, there was some brilliant documentaries, but I'm excited to see more.
I was going to say, what are your plans after this, like after you're done with me?
Lunch.
Yeah, I was going to say, you need
We're both
food.
starving.
Yes.
And then getting ready for the awards ceremony a little bit, and then watching some more films. So.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad that I'm happy to be able to finally actually talk with you before.
Yeah, and
I know we had meant to do it before.
in the future too, outside of a film festival, because there's a lot, that I think within the horror genre that is just. It's just fun to sit and talk about horror movies, man. That's what I don't
have a ton of people in my circle that really can talk horror, so that helps.
I will bring them your way. But yeah, as far as, I guess I should talk about like where people can find me.
Yeah, where can people find you? Plug
Matriarch
yourself.
Films, Matriarch Films Iowa on Instagram and Facebook. Just Matriarch Films on Vimeo. And I'll send you all the links to that stuff so you can like post it with the episode too.
Mm-hmm.
Also, if you can track me down on social media, feel free to friend request me. I won't make it too easy, but like that's fine, especially if you're in the film community. But yeah, I'm pretty out there. I admit I don't post nearly as often as I should, but I do.
It's kind of healthy though to have a healthy distance from that all.
And I'm so bad about putting my films on Vimeo. I need to upload like 3 or 4 different pieces to Vimeo that I haven't put up there yet. But like eventually, The Tower and Rot will both be up there. I've got some older works in the past couple of years I'm going to put up there soon. I'm going to try to get more on top of it.
Sure.
But life.
What are some of the things you got coming up?
I am going to be filming a movie in November called The Salvages. It's one that I've been working on for about a year. I'm really excited about it. It takes place in the same world as The Tower.
Oh, okay. Are you building a universe there?
Oh, God, I don't want to say. It's not a cinematic universe.
Yeah.
It takes place within the same story in my head. There are 2 completely disconnected films taking place during the same fictional apocalypse that I've kind of come up with. So if someone were to watch both films, they'd go, oh, yeah, that's the same thing. But like, I'm not intending for it to be like a series necessarily.
So they can still watch it on their own and they'll be fine.
Yeah. But basically, it's a movie about these 2 women at this sort of like alternative theocratic prison at the end of the world who fall in love and take brutal revenge on a abusive person who is running the prison.
Oh, geez. Wow.
So it's got some cosmic horror elements. It's got some revenge film elements. It's got a lot of drama. Mm-hmm. Really, really strong talent in front of the camera that I'm excited to feature.
New people that you're working with?
One recognizable person, Jenna Grieve, who was in The Tower, is playing the main character, Judith. Oh, the whole thing is based on the biblical story of Judith also. If anyone's familiar with that. And then a good friend of mine, Joe Frenna, who was in Roulette Girl, is playing the villain. Mm-hmm. He's amazing. And then we're actually working on casting the last role, which is Judith's partner, Abra. By the time this comes out, I will probably already have it cast, so I don't want to do a casting call out here. But if I haven't cast it yet and you want to be in one of my movies, please contact me. But no, we should have that cast in the next couple of days. But yeah, it's something I'm really excited about. It's it's sort of a project that feels like the culmination of what I've been building on for the last couple of years, as far as, again, blending that kind of horror and drama element.
Feature length, short film, or
short feature or long mid length? I'm not really sure yet. I'm estimating it'll be around an hour, but depending on how I end up editing it, it could be more of a mid length. The reason I don't know for sure is because there's a lot of kind of stage direction-y stuff in the script that I'm not 100% sure how it'll all pan out. Also, again, because of the way that I shoot, a lot of things tend to happen on the fly that change things up. So I am guesstimating anywhere from 45 to 60 minutes on this one.
Okay. Well, hey, I'm really happy that you finally sat down. We talked and whatnot. Again, I'll definitely be contacting you in the future. I'll let you know when this episode drops, everything like that. May have to have you back on to talk about cosmic horror, because you mentioned that a couple of times, and like there's questions I have on
cosmic horror is my favorite, like, broad subgenre. So please, anytime. I love cosmic horror.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I'm gonna turn this off here, but and I also, I mean, not that anyone can see this. I'm sorry about these flies.
Yeah,
we are buzzing around. I promise I'm not like in a nasty moldy place.
It's okay. It's a bad omen. I bring them with me. It's fine. But no, this was great. Thank you for having me.